Hello, everyone. This is our the second lecture about Asian art, and today we're gonna talk about the art of printing. So printing is undoubtedly uh, one of the most momentous inventions in human history. It changed the way ideas are spread and distributed. It marked the end of an age when knowledge was kept in the hands of a few privileged people. Even today, when we spend a lot of time reading on our digital devices, it seems unlikely that printed materials will disappear anytime soon. And in previous lectures, we discussed some excellent old master prints created in Europe. In this lecture, we will look at the technology and the art of printmaking from the perspective of East Asia, where printing was invented. We are going to talk about a specific type of printing, this so-called woodblock printing, which used to be the dominant way of mass reproducing texts and images in East Asia. Before we start looking at woodblock prints, I will introduce you to a technique called rubbing. It's ink rubbings. Ink rubbings made from stone carvings were predecessors of woodblock prints. After that, I will show you some Buddhist prints. These represent some of the earliest examples of woodblock printing in East Asia. Then for the most part of this lecture, we will examine Japanese color prints, which have been called pictures of the floating world. And these are one of the most renowned and admired forms of art in the modern world. Before printmaking, there existed two major ways of reproducing images and texts in East Asia, copying by hand and rubbing. The textual products resulting from the hand copying process are called manuscripts. That process doesn't require much explanation. You see an example on your left. And the second method is called rubbing. Rubbing was the predecessor of printing. It appeared shortly after the invention of paper. And here's the Chinese character for rubbing. You see a hand on the left and a stone on the right. So rubbing in Chinese means making copies from stones. The technique of rubbing was closely associated with a stone carving, or more specifically, with the inscription of Confucian texts on stones. During the 2nd century AD, a Chinese emperor ordered the inscription of all the Confucian classics on stone tablets that were subsequently erected in front of the Imperial Academy. And one way to reproduce copies of these texts was to make rubbings from the stones. Since rubbing is not a very familiar technique, even to people from East Asia, I will now show you some videos I took in a field trip with a rubbing workshop. And in these videos, you will see how a rubbing is made from a stone tablet. So you see, first, you cover stone tablet with a sheet or several sheets of moistened paper. And you press the paper repeatedly so that the paper sticks closely to the surface of the stone. And third, then you apply ink onto paper to reveal the inscriptions. In the last step, you remove the ink impressions from the stone, and this gives you a copy of the inscribed text. And then you can make an album like this on your right. So the inscriptions on this stone tablet are not Confucian classics on this specific tablet. Rather, this is an epitaph for Confucian scholar official uh, uh, which was carved into the stone. It contains the biography of the deceased and emphasizes his political achievements. In the pre-modern period, epitaphs for Chinese nobles were composed by eminent scholars and written by renowned calligraphers. So today, robins are appreciated primarily for their calligraphic value, and many prominent calligraphers in history left no works on paper or silk. The only works we have of theirs are those inscribed in stone. However, as you can tell from the videos, large quantities of robins cannot be produced quickly, right? It requires experiences and skill to produce a nice robin from a stone tablet. I tried it myself. It's very difficult to apply the ink evenly on the paper. So in China, a robin is often considered more than a reproduction. It is regarded as an artwork in its own right. Moreover, such stone tablets cannot be moved around, right? They are vertical and can be very tall. Sometimes you even need to build a scaffolding to produce a robin. And they were designed this way because the primary function of these stone carvings was to preserve texts, not to facilitate reproduction. A stone is a durable material. People believe text inscribed in stone would last forever. And once inscribed in stone, these texts cannot be changed. And the tablets would have to be destroyed or and made anew if one wanted to amend something or add something, right? And so this is why Chinese emperors wanted to inscribe these Confucian classics in stone, as you see here. It's all Confucian classics. And these objects demonstrate the authority of the texts and of the emperor. And these texts represented official versions of the classics, approved and edited by the emperor. And as I said, Robin didn't allow for the mass reproduction of texts, but this was not really an issue for Confucian scholars. They knew how to write and had remarkable memories, not like today. And they were always able to make handwritten copies of classics or simply memorize texts they wanted to study. So they can memorize all these classics inscribed in stone. As a result, for centuries, Confucian scholars showed no interest in developing a more efficient way of reproducing texts. It was not until Buddhism flourished in the land of East Asia during the 6th and 7th centuries that the technology of printing came into being. And here, you see here, that's the world's oldest printed book with a precise date. It was made in China in 868 AD. It was printed on paper with a carved wood block. So the technology is also called woodblock printing. And the printed books were first made in Europe during the 15th century, thanks to Gutenberg's invention of a printing press that used a movable metal type. And East Asia entered the age of printing more than 1,000 years earlier than Europe. And why did printmaking appear so early on in East Asia, right? That's the question. I think the answer to this question has to do with the invention of paper. Paper was invented in China as early as the 2nd century AD, but it did not make its way to Europe until the 11th century. And the paper, as you know pretty well, paper absorbs ink easily. It is light, soft, and thin, but also pretty resilient. Most importantly, paper is very cheap, right? It's affordable. Without paper, it was impossible to produce prints in vast quantities. And the invention of paper paved the way for the appearance of printmaking. And also wood is also a cheap material, right? It's available, as I showed you in the lecture on architecture. It is light, soft, and easily available in most parts of East Asia. And the next, let's take a look at the process of woodblock printing with some videos I took in a printing workshop. And the workshop has been an important producer of woodblock prints of Buddhist scriptures in China for more than 100 years. While watching the videos, you can make a comparison in your mind between this technology and that of rubbing. So the first step in making a woodblock print would be to carve a wooden block. Here's a wooden block. And these characters used as the basis for carvings were not handwritten, but printed. So the traditional paper in East Asia can be transparent. So if you were to paste a page onto a wooden block with the printed side facing down, the text would show through in reverse. And this allows carver to work with the reverse characters. And the next, you would print the characters on a sheet of paper. It's easy to see here that both the carving of the blocks and the printing of the pages are very mechanical processes. Neither the carver nor the printmaker needs to understand the content of the print. In fact, many of the people in such workshops were illiterate. Essentially, no one in the workshop needs to be an educated person in the pre-modern period. And finally, the printed pages would be stitched, sewn together. They were bound into books. And in this workshop, there is a clear division of labor, and the production of a printed book is divided into multiple steps, just like we saw in the production of porcelain. In the old days, any printed images and the texts could be reproduced right away. You would just give the workshop a book or a poster, and they could produce all the copies you wanted, just like a copy machine. And the printed text in this case is a Buddhist scripture called Diamond Sutra, one of the most important Buddhist writings in East Asia. It is around 5,200 Chinese characters long. Here's the whole book. It's a hand scroll. For Confucian scholars, who had to memorize a lot of much longer texts, to learn this by heart would really be a piece of cake. It's easy for them to memorize the whole book. Even if you were not a scholar, insofar you could read and write, it would not be an arduous job to memorize or hand copy a text like this. Then, what were the motives behind the reproduction of such a print, right? You may wonder. First, it had a lot to do with the Buddhist doctrines. In contrast to Confucianism, Buddhism has a more populist leanings, ideologically speaking. It teaches that everyone possesses the Buddha nature, even an insect or a stone. So Buddhists try to reach everyone, including the commoner, the poor people, and the illiterate, and the people who could not read and had received no education. And it was believed that a printed copy of the Buddhist text was powerful, regardless of whether you could read it or not. If you kept a print like this by your side, it would ward off evil spirits, cure your disease, and also bring you good fortune. In other words, these prints were treated like charms or talismans. It didn't even matter if the calligraphy looked unrefined. And you can imagine how such religious teachings caused the demand for Buddhist scriptures to explode, right? Everyone wanted to own such a magical print. And Buddhism created a huge market for printed texts. And furthermore, in Buddhist practices, images were as important as texts. Most Buddhist prints were accompanied by illustrations and still are today. In East Asia, Buddhism functioned not only as a religion, but also as an early form of a popular culture. And in this print, there's an inscription which tells you where the depicted scene is taking place, and there seems to be a dialogue going on between the Buddha here in the center, right? You see this is Buddha who appears as the central figure in the image, and a monk, a monk who is kneeling in front of him. It looks like a scene staged in a theater, right? And this reflects the fact that Buddhist stories were turned into folk songs, dramas, and theatrical performances. They had become a kind of sort of entertainment. An exquisite picture like this is visually pleasing, but it would be very difficult to copy by hand. So popular demand for images was another driving motivation for the invention of printmaking. Although woodblock printing was invented in East Asia because of Buddhism, these Buddhist prints are not the reason many of us are familiar with woodblock printing today. Rather, woodblock prints have had a lasting cultural impact because of Japanese color prints, which are called pictures of the floating world, right? Ukiyo-e. A central doctrine of Buddhism is that everything we see is transitory. It is famously said that form is emptiness and emptiness is a form. So that's a Buddhist teaching. According to the Buddhist perspective, we should not attach ourselves to the floating world, which is nothing but an illusion. Japanese woodblock prints are called a picture of the floating world precisely because they manifest an alternate perspective, focusing on the fleeting beauty and the pleasure of the mundane world. And you've probably seen this Van Gogh's painting, which was inspired by this Japanese color print, right? The plum blossom is a perfect symbol of the fleeting nature of beautiful things. So life is evanescent, but the question remains, shall we lament that fleetingness or shall we celebrate it? Looking at a print like this, one gets the feeling that we should probably celebrate, right? It's because you see the composition is so forceful and its color is so brilliant. And the accompanying inscriptions, these inscriptions add to the celebratory message of the image. Inadvertently, I would say, Van Gogh copied these characters as nonsensical patterns, but fortunately, Van Gogh did not mess up the order of the characters, so we can read them now and see that they indicate addresses of two brothels in the famous red light district in Tokyo. So this is not a coincidence because a lot of Japanese color prints depicted courtesans or these high-end prostitutes, as well as their interaction with their clients. And here's an example. You see in this print, we see a courtesan gets up in the middle of the night with her leg and foot partially exposed. And the artist is known for his subtle portrayal of the sensual and seductive beauty of courtesans. And this is a print by Torii Kiyonaga from around 1800. It's called Interior of a Bathhouse, and later became a well-known work among Impressionist painters in Europe. And this particular copy came from Degas' collection. And the print represents a group of nude and half-nude female figures, probably also courtesans. The postures of most of the figures look unposed, natural, or even awkward. You see here the posture of these squatting women. Some of you might have heard of it. It has been called the Asian squat. You squat with your heels touching the ground completely. It's a very common way to make oneself comfortable in East Asia. But when Europeans see it, they consider it clumsy and strange. I've also heard that only Asians can do this squat. I don't know if it is true. You can try it and see if you can get your heels to remain on the ground. In any case, these clumsy figures inspired Degas to inject a fresh new life into the old tradition of nude paintings in Europe. As you can see here, right, by Degas, he did not paint nude figures in graceful positions, nor did he render them according to antique, these classical prototypes. Rather, he painted them as they would be encountered in real life, in everyday situations. While Degas was obsessed with the novel features of these nude prints and compared them to the masterpieces of Western art history, the contemporary Japanese audience would have perceived the prints in an utterly different way. Let me show you the upper part of the print. See, here's a peeping Tom is hiding behind the wall. He's a serviceman of the bathhouse. But he is apparently not focusing on his job. This peeping Tom signifies the potential viewers or intended buyers of the print, men who wanted to be sexually aroused. So this print was essentially an erotic picture, an example of the many pornographic prints produced in Tokyo during the late 18th and the early 19th century. A lot of them are too explicit to be shown in this lecture. But it is important to remember that while the female nude has been a familiar and even revered subject in Western art, it has always had scandalous associations in the art of East Asia. And this print was also part of the urban popular culture. At the price of a bowl of noodles or even less, the average person could purchase an erotic print like this to satisfy their carnal desires. Also keep in mind that a print like this was seldom sold as an independent work. It often belonged to a series of illustrations in the format of an album or a book. And you can think of them as the antecedents of modern adult magazines like Playboy, right? And in the mid-19th century, actually, the Japanese government grew increasingly concerned about the negative impact of pornography and erotic art on the society. Moreover, as Japan opened its gates to the Western world, the Japanese emperor saw the popular urban culture that produced these sexual images as an obstacle to constructing a civilized modern nation, and bans were issued to block the production of such images, though underground circulation of erotica never stopped. Of course, Japanese prints were not always about prostitutes. This is arguably the most famous work of Japanese art in the world. In English, it is known as The Great Wave by Hokusai. I'm now going to play a video created by the British Museum, which will show you the process of making this print.
Great Wave or cherry wood. One side was so-called key block, which would have printed the outlines and the text on the image. The rest of the blocks would have been left in relief to print each of the colors in succession. Hokusai would have been involved in making the decisions about what colors to print, including the brilliant Prussian blue pigment. But as the printing run wore on, the publisher and the printers would start to cut corners, and sometimes the colors would change.
So you see that technique of color printing is very different from the technique involved in printing in black ink, right? It is more artistic and less mechanical. Admittedly, it still involves a division of labor, but many Japanese printmakers like Hokusai were well versed in each step of printmaking, from painting the images and cutting the woodblock to making the print, done by a single person. The Great Wave has a formal title inscribed in Japanese in its upper left corner. Here, it reads 36 views of Mount Fuji under wave of Kanagawa. Kanagawa refers to a region south of Tokyo, so this print represents Mount Fuji as viewed from the sea off the coast of Kanagawa. As the title suggests, this work belongs to a set of 36 prints. Each print in this series presents a view of Mount Fuji from a different place or location, such as a bridge, a temple, a tea house, a boat, a river, or a workshop. When you look at this vibrant and this kaleidoscopic subjects of these prints, you will probably assume that the painter was a young or middle-aged man full of strength and energy, right? Who traveled widely in order to take in such variegated views of Mount Fuji. But in fact, Hokusai created this set of prints at the age of 70. Nevertheless, he thought himself a young man. At the age of 75, he wrote down these words. See, all I drew by my 70th year, there's nothing worth taking into account. At 73 years, I partly understood the structure of animals, birds, insects, and the fishes, and the life of grasses and the plants. And so at 86, I shall progress further. At 90, I shall even further penetrate their secret meaning. And by 100, I shall perhaps truly have reached the level of the marvelous and divine. Here he's talking about his future like a guy who's just coming of age, right? At the age of 75, he's envisioning his art in the following 3 decades in the same way you are probably planning your career after graduation. So the amazing thing was that Hokusai did at least make it to 90, which placed him among the most long-lived and the most prolific masters in the history of the world. And the Great Wave is so popular that we often forget to ask what is so special about this print in the context of East Asian art history, right? It might be a popular print, but the Great Wave is also a work of profound complexity. There are many unique features in this print. First of all, if we look at the series to which the Great Wave belongs, we will find that Hokusai ingeniously juxtaposed the natural landscapes with a range of genre subjects that allowed him to include representations of the lives of ordinary people. In East Asian tradition, landscape and genre paintings have been considered 2 very different art forms. Generally speaking, landscape paintings are like high art, prized and promoted by cultural elites across East Asia. And the landscape paintings don't exclude human activities, but these activities tend to be highly idealized or historical. Genre paintings, on the other hand, are less prestigious. Particularly in China and Korea, they were done primarily by professional or court painters and avoided by its cultural elite, like by scholars. However, in Hokusai's art, the hierarchical distinction between landscape and genre painting didn't exist. He could shift between different kinds of painting freely and fuse these types in unexpected ways. In Hokusai's prints, the fusion of landscapes and various genre subjects created an enchanting effect. In East Asian art, landscape paintings were usually formulaic and symbolic. Paintings of masters were always treated as models that later artists would follow. So this print seems to have been derived from some iconic molds of representing Mount Fuji developed by Japanese artists, painters. And the print, therefore, responds not only to nature, but also to our history. In the Great Wave, Mount Fuji recedes into the background. At the foreground is this gigantic wave. There's also a long tradition of wave paintings in East Asia. And see here in this Chinese painting album from the 12th century, the painter depicted nothing but waves of different shapes. And these waves were charged with the symbolic meanings. In the classic book of Taoism, there's a passage that states, "The highest goodness is like water, for water is excellent in benefiting all things, and it does not strive." And furthermore, Confucius said, "The wise love water, and the benevolent love mountains." So the painting of waves was used to illustrate these ancient wisdoms. Waves were a recurring motif in Hokusai's art, and he definitely did not miss out on their symbolic power. At the age of 85, he painted some great waves on the ceiling of this ceremonial cart. I hope they call to mind some of the motifs we saw in my lecture on landscape painting. So you see the symbol of Taiji, right? The supreme ultimate, which represents the origin of the universe. To create a balance between yin and yang, these two forces, archetypical forces in the universe, Hokusai called the wave on the left a male or masculine wave. So it's like yin wave, and enclose it with the large mythical creatures. And the right wave is the female or feminine wave. Basically, this the left, that's a yang wave. The right is the yin wave, surrounded by smaller animals and plants. And when we look at the landscape of the Great Wave, we must remember that Mount Fuji and the rising waves convey a sense of eternity, both eternity of nature and eternity of history. So the Great Wave also symbolizes the origin of the universe. Even Mount Fuji seems to be emerging from the sea, right? Overlapping with the small waves in the foreground. In contrast to the landscape or seascape that points to eternity, the genre subject, a bunch of fishermen striving on the sea, reveals the ephemeral nature of the mundane life. Hokusai is a master when it comes to translating the transitory nature of life into visual language. And these fishing boats are a bit sketchy, but they are realistic enough to demonstrate the fisherman's risky and arduous work. The boats are only partially visible, They look as if they are being devoured by the waves. Moreover, as in many other prints in this series, Hokusai positions the viewer at a very low level. This gives one the sense that the artist painted this image from one of the boats. And in this way, the print becomes a documentary work, right? It invites the audience to experience the very moment of this breathtaking confrontation between man and nature. To the Japanese audience of Hokusai's time, this print must have looked very current, very fashionable, because it incorporated the latest importations of Western art styles and materials. And this is a painting done by a Japanese artist who was influenced by some of the Western oil paintings he saw. You see, the buildings in the background were foreshortened to create a spatial depth, but at the same time, they make these storks look monstrous. In the Great Wave, Hokusai was apparently inspired by the Western art to create a similar visual play between the foreground and the background. In addition to experimenting with the Western style, Hokusai also adopted a European pigment, as in the video the presenter mentioned, the Prussian blue, introduced to Japan not long ago. And this is probably the most famous work painted with the Prussian blue, right? I don't need to mention the name. In contrast to traditional pigments for prints, which look dull and faded, the imported pigment gave Hokusai's prints a shimmering, pulsating surface, which even recalls this silvery texture of the blue and white porcelain. Right? It's a bowl we talked about in last lecture. And in fact, Hokusai's art benefited greatly from his familiarity with the handicrafts, or decorative art as we call it today. So let's look more closely at Hokusai's wave. It looks overwhelming, right? It is often mistaken as the depiction of a tsunami. It's not a tsunami. The wave has a clear outlines as if it was carved out of ice or being frozen in motion. It has such a distinct shape that you can easily cut it out from the background and make for stuff like bookmarks. And remember, Hokusai was he actually was the foster son of an eminent mirror-making family. And this tangible and decorative quality must have been borrowed from handicrafts like ironwork of the time. Take this piece of a sword. This is a part of a sword, for example, right? It is also decorated with a wave. So this ironwork design allows one to literally hold a wave in one's hand, right? You can hold it in your hand. And then we can thus understand Hokusai to be an artist who refused to be defined by any conventional labels or confined to any traditional categories. He crossed numerous boundaries in the art world and undertook multiple roles. So he was a painter, he's a printmaker, an artist, and a craftsman. He was well versed in Japanese and Chinese literature and philosophy, and was also a great calligrapher. But nevertheless, he was not what one would call scholar painter or elite painter. He never confined himself to the ivory tower, the world of scholars or these classics. Rather, he ventured to explore the lives of ordinary people. He showed tremendous passion for painting Japanese landscapes and people, but he did not seem to want to hold his native culture above others. It is said that he kept a full card of reference sketches related to Chinese, Japanese, and European arts. And this is not to say that Hokusai was not a person of his time. His versatile art mirrored the diversity and dynamism of Japanese society and culture during the 18th and the 19th centuries. Hokusai was a freelance commercial artist. He painted for anyone who could afford his work. It didn't matter if they were military generals, merchants, scholars, or commoners. He possessed an unmatched talent, a superb skill, an adventurous spirit, but no less importantly, a savvy market sense. He knew how to attract as many audiences as possible to his art. We know he even held painting parties in tea houses and sold his works on site to whomever could afford them. To a certain extent, the diverse tastes of his customers, clients, shaped Hokusai's art. Another fascinating fact about Hokusai's art is that he was not the sole creator of some of his greatest works. One of his daughters, called Oe, worked with him closely during the final 3 decades of his life. Here's a drawing by Hokusai's pupil from his memory about Hokusai and his daughter working together. We don't know Oe's exact dates of birth and death. She was probably born in 1800 when Hokusai was 37 and outlived her father by about 20 years. When she was in her early 20s, Oe married a young painter, but she divorced him just 3 years after their marriage because we know that she thought her husband a lousy artist and always made fun of his art, or so it is said. It would be hard not to do so, right, with a father like Hokusai, being a daughter of Hokusai. And 1 year after her divorce, Oe's mother died, so she moved in with her father and worked as his assistant from then on. And most of Hokusai's late works do not show the name of his daughter. This is one of the few prints inscribed with both Hokusai and his daughter's names. Hokusai painted a line in the center, and Oe finished the flowers on the border. And don't think that Oe could only paint these seemingly minor decorative patterns, as you will see later. Later on, Oe was very good at figure paintings. In this print, it's more likely that the father and the daughter were again playing with the idea of this yin and yang, while this fierce beast and the forceful ink brush stroke were firmly associated with the male painting masters in East Asian tradition. Here's on your right, there's another line by Hokusai. And these faintly outlined, colorful, shaded flowers were often linked to female artists. So again, these flowers on your left, painted by Oe. So you see this interplay between father and daughter, and men and women. And to fully appreciate Oe's talent, you need to look at these 2 paintings. None of her father's works resembles them. The left one is a painting on silk. It's called Girl Composing a Poem Under Cherry Blossoms in the Night. On the right, we have a painting on paper that represents a street view of this playroom or entrance to a brothel in the pleasure quarter of Tokyo. And these 2 paintings show you that Oe did not blindly admire her father's achievements. Instead, she developed a unique style of her own, featuring night scenes with dramatic light effects. Her use of light might have been inspired by the so-called chiaroscuro, a technique that was employed in some of the European paintings brought to Japan by Dutch merchants. But the OS subjects, beautiful women, were indisputably Japanese. Drawing on the Western lighting technique, she found a new way to represent the elusive and evanescent nature of beauty. And on the left, only the face, hands, and a small part of the lady's robe are lit up. On the right, the faces of the courtesans can just barely be made out in the shadows of the brothel windows. Although the beauty of these women make them appear to be sources of light, the light of their beauty is depicted as being as frail as a light of the candles, right? Light that could be swallowed up by the dark night at any moment. And generally speaking, Japanese color prints possess a strong cinematic quality. In these prints, one often sees an emphasis on conveying a sense of movement, space, and atmosphere. Let me show you another video made by an artist in France that animates a couple of prints by prominent Japanese artists working in the period between the early 19th to early 20th century. You can see how easily these prints can be turned into moving pictures over the course of 100 years. You see, these Japanese color prints come to look increasingly like scenes from a movie. And this last print, this last one, was done by an artist active in the early 20th century, when the art of photography and film had already become familiar to most. Now, if you look at OS paintings, you can really appreciate how her art was indeed ahead of its time, right? What is elusive and evanescent in these paintings is more than feminine beauty. Art itself is shown to be ephemeral. These paintings foresee a new age when the meaning of art is hard to define and its value is difficult to pin down. This is the age we live in. In the following weeks, other professors will introduce you to the modern and contemporary art. With the paintings of Oe, I conclude my lectures for this semester. Thank you very much, and I hope you all stay safe and take care for the rest of the semester. Thank you.